Everyone, to today's local government education program provided by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Mike Delaney, and I am an Extension Community and Economic Development educator based in Ogle County up here in the Northern State Line region. We're delighted that you've decided to join us today for our annual State Legislative Update program. I'll start with a few quick housekeeping notes. First, please write any questions you might have into the Zoom chat space by clicking on the chat icon at the lower center of the Zoom screen. We'll review the questions in a Q&A period following the presentations. I'll remind you that if you have any problems connecting to the webinar or otherwise hearing or seeing anything, please identify those via the chat if you can, and someone will try to assist you. Finally, please remember that after the conclusion of today's presentation, all registered participants will receive an email with slides and a link to the recording of the webinar. If you did not register for the webinar, please put your email into the chat box to let us know that you'd like to receive the materials. We're delighted to welcome back this morning two presenters who are eminently qualified to speak on this particular subject. Kelly Murray has served as executive director of the Illinois Association of County Board Members since 1997. She's a registered lobbyist, has served on several state boards, and has over 2 decades of experience in local government relations, having also served as executive director for the Illinois Association of Regional Councils, legislative consultant for the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, and editor of County to County magazine. Likewise, Taylor Anderson, a full-time registered contractual lobbyist in the state of Illinois, has spent nearly a decade working with the Illinois General Assembly. Since 2008, Taylor has traveled across the state speaking on the impact of various legislation and legislative issues, specifically legislation affecting Illinois counties. So without further ado, Kelly, let's start with you this morning. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mike. I'd just like to welcome everyone to our annual legislative webinar. I truly appreciate your participation today. I know you're all very busy as county officials and as local government officials. We've been conducting this webinar for probably probably getting close to 2 decades now, and I want to personally thank the University of Illinois Extension for hosting this webinar series. It features great educational content throughout the year, and so I kind of encourage you to tap into future ones as your schedule allows. I know Nancy and I have been discussing some additional webinars coming up in the next couple months, maybe possibly, that are going to also lend some support to your efforts with the federal ARRA funds. So keep an eye out on your calendar for those. I do want to recognize today we have with us Michael Holliday Jr. He's the new president of the Illinois Association of County Board Members. Some feedback, all right. And just to tell you a little bit, I just want to also thank you guys as member counties, because the association has been in existence since the 1960s. So this ongoing networking and support all of you bring to the association and the state policy platform is a valuable asset to all of the Illinois residents. So thank you all for your time and commitment in working with us and collectively for your counties. Our presentation today will primarily focus on new laws for 2022 that impact local government. We had well over 600 bills that have been enacted into law since the start of the 102nd General Assembly. In addition, we're going to conclude with some comments on pending legislation as part of our ongoing policy agenda for county governments. The spring session schedule, the 2022 session of the Illinois General Assembly, is going to be even shorter than originally planned. Due to recent surge in the COVID-19 cases. Leaders of both chambers announced that the Illinois House and Senate will not be meeting in person at this time until February, and they're going to continue remote committee work in the meantime. So both chambers adopted special rules allowing committee meetings to be held remotely and for some members to participate in floor debate and vote on legislation remotely. So I want you to be aware of that. We were already experiencing, a shortened session, so we're down to about 10 weeks. Lawmakers typically meet from January through the end of May, with a short veto session held in October and November. So, however, this year, they originally planned to meet only from January 4th through April 8th. And the main focus being passing a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. We do anticipate the budget is probably going to be flat, but there are a few things they're going to need to do with respect to federal funds. So we do know there's going to be some changes to the budget, but we do know that will probably be pushed through without much opposition. The reasoning behind the shortened session is also aimed at leaving lawmakers time to campaign ahead of this year's primary, which was pushed back to June 28th due to delays in last year's redistricting process. So being an election year, it is not unusual for the more controversial measures to take a back seat, as you all know, with primary advancements of sort of agreed to bill packages and the budget. Now, we might see there were a lot of key packages from 2021, many omnibus packages, that we could see trailer legislation in 2022. There is some cleanup needed on some of these issues, and likely those may be pushed forward. So we had the clean energy omnibus, electric vehicle package, gaming expansion, the election omnibus, ethics redistricting, and then we had a variety of COVID-19 programs. So we might see some revisiting of those. The General Assembly will pass a fiscal year 2023 budget. We know that for sure. It'll probably be not much different than the one in 2022. We don't assume there's going to be a lot of variations. However, they are going to appropriate Illinois' remaining American Rescue Plan Act ARPA funds. Besides the budget, we are hearing, crime is a major issue heading into the midterm election. Several Cook County legislators have already come out and are looking to advance maybe some community and mental health-based solutions to kind of address the crime violence that we've seen sort of peak within the city of Chicago. So those could be things that are going to be maybe put forward, even though we have a short window. But again, we'll have to kind of wait and see based on the schedule and what time is going to allow, because usually, we come back from spring break in April, and then we go into the budget process and go all the way through the end of May. So by ending on April 8th, this is going to be a very condensed session. And you're also going to see the governor next week give his state of the state and budget address on the same day. So everything's being condensed. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our legislative consultant, Taylor Anderson, to get us started on the new laws review, and then I'll join you back at the end of the session. So Taylor?
Thanks, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think Kelly did an excellent job kind of summarizing where we're at currently in spring session 2022. I'd like to turn back the page for a second, though, and talk about what happened last year, some of the bills that made it through the process, the budget, and those bills that were signed into law that are now going to be effective. Many of them were effective January 1st. As you all are aware, obviously the pandemic had a pretty outsized effect on all of our lives, and that's true as well for the General Assembly. Last year saw the General Assembly meet in kind of a hybrid form, similar to what we're seeing at the beginning of this year. The first couple of months of last year, because of the surge and then the new variant, Delta variant, legislators weren't meeting very regularly in Springfield, and they were doing a lot of their committee work remotely. And that's been true at the start of this year as well. Because of that, a lot of bills were moved through the process with maybe less scrutiny than they would normally receive when everyone's in the Capitol building and the normal process and procedures are in place. However, that said, the number of bills that actually managed to reach the governor's desk wasn't too outside from what we'd see in a normal year. There was about 664 bills that passed through both chambers and made it to the governor's desk. We did have a veto session in October. There wasn't really a ton of action on vetoes during the veto session because the General Assembly last year met through much of the summer. If you can remember, they adjourned a little late. They went over their May 31st deadline because there were some budgetary issues that still needed to be resolved. They actually went into June. But once the budget was resolved in, I believe, June 2nd, the General Assembly still came back a couple of different times in late July and in September. And when they were coming in during the summer, they were actually taking up some of the veto actions that the governor had managed to do, that had managed to reach his desk before October veto session. So the veto session in the fall was a little different than what we normally would see, because there wasn't really any vetoes for the General Assembly to take up. In fact, they spent the time during the veto session addressing new issues and new bills. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see as of this writing, there's 694 new laws that have been enacted in the state as part of the 102nd General Assembly, the first year of the 102nd General Assembly. Obviously, that number will increase as we get through the second year of the 102nd General Assembly. We'll talk a little bit about the budget. It was a rosier budget outlook than we would normally see. At the end of 2020, we were anticipating quite a large budget deficit, somewhere around the $3 billion range. But because of some of the relief from the federal government, because of a stronger economy and more robust expenditures by folks on the sales side and things, the money that the state actually collects was significantly higher than anticipated. And so the budget shortfall wasn't as dire as we thought it was going to be in 2020. And so they were able to pass a fairly balanced budget. And that's somewhat unusual in Illinois. So there was two budget bills, Senate Bill 2800 and Senate Bill 2017. And the budget was about, $42.3 billion. They also made some additional reappropriations in the capital bill for capital projects to the tune of about $52 billion. So all in all, it was a pretty solid, balanced, fair budget. As Kelly mentioned, next week, or the beginning of February 3rd, the governor is set to give his budget address and state of the state, which will outline the budget for fiscal year 2023. Projected numbers, again, appear to be pretty rosy for the state of Illinois. There is a projected budget deficit for fiscal year 2023 of about $300 to $400 or so million, which when you're looking at a budget the size of $43 billion, a couple $100 million isn't really as big as it sounds. So again, pretty sound fiscal footing right now, which is which we haven't been able to say over the past 10 years or so. And so hopefully that makes the budgeting process a little easier. As Kelly said, they're supposed to adjourn April 8th this year, which is about a month and a half earlier than they would normally adjourn. And we are hoping that because there isn't a severe budget deficit, that they might actually be able to get the work done and adjourn with the budget passed by April 8th. There is still some skepticism about whether or not that April 8th adjournment deadline is really going to hold firm. And I do think we'll probably see the General Assembly run over a little bit, either a couple of days, or they might take a week off and come back and actually finish and wrap things up. So we'll move on now to some of the bills that were passed last year and signed into law are now the law of the land. But I did want to just talk briefly about the budget and last year's budget and what we're anticipating for next year's budget. As Kelly mentioned, there were several omnibus packages that were passed last year and several large packages of bills that were put together and moved through the process. A large part of that is due to the disruption that we saw in 2020 when the General Assembly barely met and I believe only passed a handful of bills. 7 or less bills were actually passed in 2020, which is obviously a wide disparity with the 694 bills that were signed into law this past year. So because of that, a lot of issues and a lot of legislators' agenda items were rolled over and punted into 2021, where many of those ideas were kind of cobbled together and placed into large packages. We saw things dealing with the election code, energy and climate change, and governmental ethics reform, just to name a few. But 2021 could really be characterized as a year of the large omnibus bill and all the various packages that were put together. We'll move now to just kind of the individual bills, again, that most have already started to take effect, or effective date being January 1st of 2022. There are a couple that will take effect in the middle of this year, and we'll be sure to point those out. Now, when the capital bill was passed back in 2019, I believe, part of that was, or part of the cost structure for the capital bill was an increase in various vehicle registration fees, whether you were a trucker, whether you just have one car. However, one of the fees that was increased caused a lot of pushback and consternation, and that had to do with the trailer fees. And I know Kelly and myself heard particularly a lot of angst over this issue, where small trailer licenses had been increased to $118 per individual trailer. This bill lowered that down to $36. Excuse me. It also reduced some of the other fees. So there was, this was kind of a reaction to the reaction of the outsized fee increase that I think people just thought was too high. There was some rumors when the capital bill was originally passed that was a mistake, that the trailer fees weren't supposed to be that high, that it was an error in drafting, so to speak. But the fact that it took until 2021 to actually see a change or reduction in those fees, I think leaves many skeptical about that or not. Nevertheless, that reduction in fee is now the law of the land. It took effect in January 1st of this year. Another bill that we want to make sure you all are aware of that became law adds a screening to all of the coverages that you all provide. It's a mandated coverage. And this deals with pancreatic cancer. For a while, there has been a push to include more screening for various cancers. We know that pancreatic cancer, is a fast-moving cancer, and so there was a large push to try to really increase the ability for people to be screened earlier in the process, rather than wait until that cancer reaches the later stage 3 or stage 4. And so now that's the law of the land. I haven't heard yet, I don't know if Kelly has, if this has impacted premiums or rates, to a large degree. There was some concern from the insurance community that this would, essentially cause costs to rise. And I haven't heard anything as of yet. Feel free if you're aware to share in the chat or with Kelly via email. But this was a change, again, to try to get more screening early in the process. We want to make sure you're all aware of it. As you're reviewing your medical coverages, this needs to be a part of that now moving forward. One of the controversial bills from this past year was Senate Bill 1169, excuse me, which has commonly been referred to as the Right of Consciousness Act. I remember when the Right of Consciousness Bill was originally passed, and as several legislators who were there during the time as well can attest to, there was not really a thought of an international pandemic really being part of that conversation. So this law was introduced and passed and really clarifies that the Right of Consciousness Act does not apply to COVID-19 requirements. There was a slew of lawsuits that had been filed utilizing the Right of Consciousness Act to preempt an employer's ability to impose COVID-19 requirements in the workplace. So this clarifies that's not a credible exemption, places it in law. Kelly does have a note here at the bottom. It is important for employees to be aware that employees obviously can still cite the various federal exemptions for health and religious reasons, and that this law, unlike the past few we just talked about, does not become effective until June 1st of 2022. So this is one of those acts that takes effect in the middle of the year. That was done because there are certain restrictions on how many votes are needed and when a bill is passed that mandate a higher number of votes needed to require something to become effective on January 1st if it's done after the end of spring session versus a lower vote threshold required if it takes effect June 1st or later. And so that's one of the big reasons why this bill won't be effective until June 1st of 2022. But it is on the horizon. We wanted to make sure and that you were all aware of this as employers, that after June 1st, the Right of Consciousness Act will not be a credible exemption for employees to get around COVID-19 requirements that you might impose in your county workplaces. Senate Bill 1697 is next bill we'll talk about. This had been a priority for our association and several other local government associations across the state. Essentially, when the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or commonly referred to as GATA, was put into place, there was not a real thought that things like the local government distributor fund, motor fuel tax, and a couple of others are actually, by constitutional, considered grants, even though they functionally have nothing in common with grants. In the case of local government distributor fund, that is the state acting as a receiving agency for income tax dollars that they collect on behalf of units of local government to then be remitted. Again, doesn't share much in line with the grant. For things like motor fuel tax, there's already audits that are done by the Department of Transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So it took us a couple of years to be able to get this bill through. I know back in 2019, for instance, there was a handful of bills all aiming to do the same thing. So Senate Bill 1697, removes that kind of duplication of auditing that GATA kind of placed on things like LGDF, personal property replacement tax, motor fuel tax, and transportation renewal fund. So very happy to see that. Obviously, our hope is that frees up, more time. It was really, I think, one of those unintended things that was placed into law. And unfortunately, once it was in law, it became quite difficult to remove out of law. And happily, we were successful in doing so with Senate Bill 1697, along with many of the other local government associations, such as IML and others that were seeking to do similar things for their members. So very happy to see that that's in place now. This actually has been in effect for a while. It became effective on August 27th of 2021. A couple more bills we want to just bring to your attention as they are new laws on the books, and you might have to change how your procedures and how you operate and do things at the local level. Senate Bill 2356 deals with closed meeting minutes, and this requires that each unit of local government must review the minutes of all closed meetings once every 6 months. There was, I believe that this came from, you know, an issue where new board members were having trouble accessing closed session meetings from prior to when they became board members. And so this now, you know, mandates that, again, every local government has to review those closed doors meetings, really, again, to try to get around some of those things that were happening in certain areas of the state where new members weren't able to go back and look at old closed door meetings. Again, depending on how, excuse me, you already went through this process, or if you have a structure in place, take a look at that. Just make it part of, you know, something that you do as part of your process every 6 months to make sure you're complying with the new law. House Bill 56 amends the Local Government Officer Compensation Act. This is new. You know, we do see stipend bills every once in a while, but this requires that compensation of county elected officers to be fixed by ordinance or resolution by the county board. And such ordinance must separately list each stipend as well as compensation for each elected official. I think the idea behind this was transparency. And so, again, make sure that, you know, moving forward, that this, again, is part of your process and your procedure. You're going to have to list those out separately now. So if you adopt an ordinance, just make sure that each of those stipends, as well as the compensation, is now listed separately. And it's something that must be done moving forward. Another new bill is House Bill, or another new law, excuse me, is House Bill 453. And this is part of a larger trend that we've seen from the state in recent years to try to collect more data about the number and types of vendors that are being used. Not just at the local level, the state has done this for all of their various agencies, as well as the higher education community and healthcare. They're really trying to get more data. So this requires that taxing districts with an aggregate property tax levy of more than $5 million must make a good faith effort to collect and publish all of the vendors and subcontractors doing business with that taxing district that are either minority-owned, women-owned, or veteran-owned businesses. And again, this is to try to capture as much data out there about how many vendors are minority-owned, women-owned, or veteran-owned, how many are out there, where they're located, and what entities are making use of their service. There is conversations that are continuing regarding this bill. Excuse me. There could be potentially some more conversations. There might need to be some tweaks or some changes to this, but obviously we will keep you up to speed as those conversations continue, and whether or not any language is introduced to make any changes to this particular piece of legislation. But again, it is new. It is now the law of the land. And so it's something that, again, you're going to need to make at least a good faith effort to try and collect and publish. And I think that's one of the key pieces. It's not just to collect that data, but you also have to publish it of what types of vendors and subcontractors you're doing business with at the local level. House Bill 2449 was a response to, again, the pandemic. This allows for county board chair to hold special meetings regardless of whether or not the chair was elected at large or elected internally by county board members. There was a provision in, or the older statute, I should say, allowed for this ability to hold special meetings only for chairs that were elected at large and not for chairs that were elected by county board members. This now changes that. And the reason for this is because obviously during the pandemic, there were a couple times and a couple cases where counties needed to respond quite quickly to something and just weren't able to hold a special meeting. The chair wasn't able to call for one. And so, again, this is a response to try to allow a little more flexibility for counties. It's now, again, the law of the land. It took effect last year in August 20th of 2021. Moving on, House Bill 2950. This expanded the number of counties that this applies to, but essentially allows for DuPage, Kane, Lake, Will, and McHenry counties to use the motor fuel tax to fund construction, improving, and the acquiring of land, basically for bike paths. I think the reason why this was kind of in the past and now why it's been applied to these specific counties is because these counties tend to see a higher concentration of urban settings with more pedestrians and more bike usage. And so this creates a little more flexibility with how motor fuel tax can be used. Because of the constitutional amendment that placed the lockbox on, how transportation dollars can be used, they felt that they needed a new law to actually allow this and make sure that this was allowable. So this bill was effective immediately upon signing. And again, if you live in DuPage, Kane, Lake, Will, and McHenry, you'd be able to use motor fuel tax proceeds for this. There have been conversations about expanding this to include more counties or potentially all counties, whether or not they have urban areas or not, just depending on if it's a high traffic area for bikes or a particular high traffic area for pedestrians. So those conversations are continuing. We might see a bill or two in the future, looking to expand this list, and obviously we'll keep everyone abreast of that moving forward. Another controversial issue has been the Safety Act, which was passed in lame duck session of 2021, early last year. The criminal justice reform bill was quite controversial when it came out. It was a large omnibus package that did a lot and made a lot of changes to criminal justice in the state of Illinois. Since then, there have been two trailer bills that have sought to clarify and make small tweaks and changes to how that bill operates moving forward. One of the things that the original bill also did is it created a task force that had a large number of stakeholders participate, from legislators to various members of law enforcement to various locally elected officials. And some of the dialogue and discussions that took place in that task force resulted in an additional trailer bill, which I think we'll talk about next. But I always like to remind people, anytime you have a large omnibus bill, it usually takes a couple of years and a couple of trailer bills to kind of work out all the various kinks, all the various different problems that might arise. There's a very large gap between what happens on paper in legislation and the real world actually functions, and we come across that problem of that gap in all types of pieces of legislation, including things like this. So House Bill 3443, Kelly's got the highlights bolded here, but basically clarified provisions of use of force, clarified that resisting arrest and obstruction of police officer are distinct criminal acts. There was some confusion with regards to the language originally about where resisting arrest and obstruction were placed. This clarifies that they are indeed criminal acts. This also allows for an officer, with the approval of a supervisor, to file a report. In the original bill, that report needed to be filed before an officer could review their body camera footage. This bill allowed for now, again, with supervisor approval, for the officer to review that camera footage before submitting a report. And it also made some changes to the increased training that was placed in the original bill. Some of the dates, obviously because of the pandemic, but also just because of cost, time, and effort, some of the dates in the original bills just weren't manageable to have new training established, to have new programs up and running, and then to actually have officers go through those expanded training opportunities. And so this bill did a number of things to ease some of the consternation. The next bill we'll talk about, House Bill 3512, as I mentioned earlier with the task force, made some more adjustments because of those conversations and dialogues that were, excuse me, that were taking place. I will say, I know one of the largest issues of concern that I've heard from county officials and from sheriffs across the state has to deal with excuse me, qualified immunity. At this point in time, having talked to some of the lead sponsors on this issue, I do not believe we're going to see an effort to remove qualified immunity for law enforcement officers. Now, that isn't to say that there won't be a bill or two introduced. That isn't to say that the conversation about how qualified immunity works won't continue. But I don't think, I think after the conversations, after the education, that many legislators that have been knee deep in this issue, now they understand how the role of qualified immunity, and I just don't think we're going to see an effort to seriously repeal that. As Kelly mentioned earlier, obviously, law enforcement and safety is going to be a huge issue in this year's election, and between that and the education that the legislators who have led this conversation have undergone, it just doesn't appear at this time, or really for the foreseeable future, that we're going to see qualified immunity eliminated. So again, this bill went back, moved some more dates around for law enforcement training, how the certification for a police officer would work. It also made sure that things like simply labeling that body camera footage as body camera footage would not be considered tampering. That was one of the another issue in the original bill that was left too vague and open to interpretation. So they clarified some of those things. We could potentially see another trailer bill that makes some additional changes or tweaks to the Safety Act this year, but those conversations are ongoing. But as I said, I don't believe qualified immunity will be part of those. With that, we'll move into 2020 legislative session. Again, as Kelly mentioned, we we're kind of repeating what happened last year to some extent, where legislative days in Springfield are being canceled due to the increase in positivity rates and hospitalization. And so a lot of work has started out, and a lot of committees are being held by meeting remotely. It's certainly not, I think, a favored process or approach of anyone. Certainly not my favorite way for the state to conduct the business of the General Assembly, but you know, considering the times we live in, that's kind of what we've had to work with. I will say, and I really can't stress this enough. I know I've mentioned it, and I know Kelly mentioned it already, but the big difference between this year and last year is the time constraint and the fact that the General Assembly is set to adjourn on April 8th. Since the spring session, which was supposed to convene on January 4th, was moved to January 5th, the General Assembly has only been in Springfield for one day. So we have essentially lost out on the entire month of January of work being done, of legislators being in person in Springfield, and that is going to have significant repercussions and ramifications on the number of bills that are moved through the process, that are able to have real thoughtful dialogue and real committee hearings. We're going to see such a logjam of bills as legislators all rush to try to move their agenda items and their pieces of legislation through the process. There's only so many hours in a day. There's only so many committee hearings a single legislator can be at the same time. It is really going to be quite interesting how this all plays out. With that said, one of the things that we normally see is in the first year of a General Assembly, the non-election year, we see about 6,000 bills introduced. In the election year, the second year of a General Assembly, which is what 2022 is, we usually see that number in half. We see about 3,000 bills introduced. Even with the time constrained this year, we're almost on pace for 3,000 bills. I think we'll probably get there. So even though we're facing such a time constraint on this spring session, the volume of bills hasn't really changed all that much. So this past Friday was the deadline for Senate bills to be introduced. This upcoming Friday is the deadline for House bills to be introduced. So we're still waiting on a whole host of House bills to be introduced, but this is just kind of a quick snapshot, a taste, if you will, of the kinds of bills that we've been seeing so far this year for spring session. We talked a little bit about local government distributor fund and having that be removed from GATA. One of the things I know Kelly and I also like to always try to remind county board members to not lose sight of is of the fact that local government distributor fund had for 30 plus years always been 10%. Local governments received 10% of the income tax that the state collected. That number was slashed to 6% and has been 6% for quite a while because of the income tax increase. We have been pushing to try and get LGDF back up to 10%. Again, those are local dollars that are owed to you. They are generated in your local communities, and they should be going back to those local communities to help fund local services. This bill takes a little bit of a different approach. Instead of trying to get us from 6 all the way back to 10, this tries to move the needle a little bit by going from 6 to 8%. So we're very excited to see this bill. There's also a companion House bill that we will be supporting. I don't have the exact figures, but if I looked at what local governments have lost out on since local government distributor fund has been cut in half, it's a shocking number. I mean, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. You know, if you're a county, you could go back and probably see how much dollars you've missed out on by the reduction in the percentage that you receive from local government distributed funds. So we're hopeful. We have a list of former local government officials in the General Assembly who are really pushing this. Leading this charge in the Senate has been Senator DeWitt and Senator Laura Murphy, who's the lead sponsor of Senate Bill 3010. She's also in Senate Democratic leadership. And so that's a very strong sponsor for us and a very strong push in the Senate. And in the House, we have Representative Anthony DeLuca, who's a former mayor and really has been pushing hard on this issue. So we have two bills, one in the Senate, one in the House, and we're really looking forward to an opportunity to try to advance these pieces of legislation to return more of those local dollars back to local communities. Senate Bill 3038 is a new bill. We haven't really seen this before, or at least I haven't seen it before. And it makes some changes to how, you know, entities, parties negotiating might have to change if this becomes law. Provides that no agreement or contract entered into by the state or any local government or any party negotiating on behalf of such governmental entity for projects or economic development. And then it lists a whole variety of different types of things, including but not limited to things like tax incentives, tax abatements, bonds, notes, liens, grants, rebates. None of those may have any provision that provides that the agreement or contract of any of its terms are confidential, and that the parties to the agreement or contract are prohibited from disclosing, discussing, or describing the terms of the agreement. So we wanted to get some feedback on this. Not really sure. You know, I think that this, to me, is one of those bills that might have a very kind of narrow focus on it. But to me, this seems like it could have very large ripple effects and repercussions. And so we wanted to make sure that we got some feedback, that we made you all aware of this bill. It's still in Senate assignment, so it has not been assigned to committee yet. But if you have thoughts, if you have knowledge of ways this might impact you for good or for ill, please let Kelly know. We want to make sure that we're approaching, you know, these types of new bills with good data and, you know, good facts, so that the sponsor can understand, that the General Assembly can understand how a bill like this could impact counties across the state. Senate Bill 3063 is an unfunded mandates prohibition. There is already a law like this on the books, and so really this is kind of symbolic in many instances. One of the kind of cardinal rules is no General Assembly can bind the hands of future General Assemblies via law. They can only do that via constitutional amendment, which obviously needs to be approved or ratified by the citizens of the state. So while this is something that we obviously support, and it's one of those things that we always see year after year, just the volume of unfunded mandates being shoved and placed on, you know, to local government. You know, this bill doesn't necessarily have the teeth that I certainly would like to see something like this take up. However, if this does gain some steam, if it is able to move, you know, we think it would be great. It's been quite some years, but probably almost 10 years now or so, our association put forward a constitutional amendment that would actually prohibit unfunded mandates from being passed by the General Assembly. If this were to gain some steam, that might be a conversation we could revisit, because really that's the only way to prevent unfunded mandates from being passed by the General Assembly. Symbol 3139 deals with probation officers reimbursement. I know that probation officers and their reimbursement is always an issue, for counties. I do know, and I know Kelly and I have talked about this, that while this is still an issue, a larger problem seems to be what's happening with folks being kept in county jails and not being taken by the Department of Corrections. So I have not seen any bill yet introduced to address that issue. I do know that there have been conversations with the governor's office and with the Department of Corrections. I do not know how fruitful those conversations are or will be, but that's certainly an issue that we're keeping our eye on, because that seems to be a very costly issue right now, probably even more so than probation officers reimbursement, at least from some of the counties that I've heard from. Senate Bill 3460 deals with administrative leave, and so this is again, I don't necessarily know we've seen language in this form. But basically, if a county board member, chairperson, state's attorney, or other countywide elected official is criminally charged, the county board shall review the alleged crimes, and then by a 3/5 vote of all members, if the countywide elected official should be placed on administrative leave. This bill, again, I don't think it's necessarily something we had seen. Obviously they're trying to tie it to violation of official oath. But this is going to be one I think some real conversations need to be had around. I don't yet know if any of the if the state's attorneys or the state bar has weighed in on this. If this violates due process at all, but certainly one we wanted to bring to everyone's attention, one we'll be keeping a close eye on, and we'll be having some conversations about regarding to how, if, and when we should weigh in on this particular issue. Excuse me.
Taylor,
We'll
just
skip down.
Taylor, just let me interrupt here. We've got about 5 minutes before noon.
Yep. I'm going to skip to just one bill I really want to make sure folks are aware of. We saw this last year as a standalone bill. I know it caused quite a ruckus, amongst county board members. It was attempted to be inserted into the large omnibus bill for green energy, the energy bill, and it was unsuccessful, and so they've reintroduced that, and it's House Bill 4452. Essentially, this would preempt and supersede all the county ordinances that you have for how wind energy works in your specific county. So this would try to create a statewide standard for how wind energy facilities can be zoned, where they can go, how tall they can be, what the process is going to be like. It's a very one-size-fits-all approach to this issue. And if there's one thing I've learned about Illinois is one-size-fits-all approaches don't work very well in a state as large as ours, as diverse as ours, as geographically and regionally different as ours, and with 102 counties. So this was an issue that we strongly opposed last year. I imagine will be the same this year. We certainly will enter into conversations with the sponsor about why he thinks this is necessary moving forward. We know that this language, which is the exact same as last year, is being pushed by the wind energy some of the wind energy industry. And, I don't think it's one that makes a lot of sense in the state of Illinois. And because of that, like I said, I think we'll be very opposed to it. So Kelly, I didn't know if you had anything to add. That was kind of the last bill that I wanted to make sure, really people were aware of, again, because I know the attention it drew last year. This is one of those bills that really preempts what you're able to do at the local level and making sure that, your zoning ordinances work for your specific county. And I think there's a problem with that.
Correct. I think Taylor, he makes a very good point there. So again, that's one of those bills that kind of resurfaced back, and we'll be probably in negotiations on it again. But I do think maintaining the local control when it comes to these types of sightings is important, and I believe most of our, if not all of our counties, believe the same. So again, thank you, Taylor. We have a couple more slides there you guys can look at on your own with pertaining to new bills introduced. I would let you know we've got the calendar date up. It's important dates coming forward, like we said, with the governor's State of the State and budget address next week. Everything's going to be fairly rushed. So again, it's going to be an interesting session for all of us, depending on how often they're going to meet and how they're going to proceed, with the COVID-19 issue still at the forefront. So again, if you have any questions, you can kind of forward Taylor. You can stay informed with us. If you're members of the association, as you know, you get our counties at the Capitol on a regular basis. I also have a new laws summary that I publish at the end of every year, and it's about a 16-page booklet, and it contains everything we talked about today, among many other bills. So, Nancy, it might be easier if I just forward you a copy of that, and if you're going to send out the slides to everyone, we can attach the new laws summary. That way, everybody that was on the phone today will get a copy of that. It is a member's benefit if you're part of the county, but I know we have a lot of people on the phone with us today that might be from township government or other levels, so that would be something that would be beneficial for you all to have. So I'll send that on to Nancy, and she can forward it on with the slides to you. Our website's at ilcounty.org, so again, we put up a lot of information there if you want to take a look at anything throughout the year. Otherwise, if you have any questions from today or as we move through session, don't hesitate to reach out to Taylor or myself. Our email address is on there, and we'll be happy to assist you. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Mike, for today's presentation. We appreciate the opportunity.
Well, terrific. If you don't mind sticking around for a few more minutes, we've got a couple questions that have been posed. In the meantime, we've just put up a quick poll for the attendees. If you wouldn't mind taking just a second to react, we'd appreciate it greatly. One little civics question posed by Ted Hollander that might be of interest to some folks. Up front, there was a reference to the fact that there were 694 new laws with only 664 bills passed. How did we get there?
I think I clarified that. Well, we have spring session, which ends. So that was the number coming out of the first part of the spring session. And then there were special sessions held, and then we have veto session. So obviously, there are always bills that are passed during special sessions and veto sessions, which increase the number. So it's just the difference between when the spring session ended and the final year number.
Always something to be done. One more question. Has the state discussed the new federal mandate for commercial driver's license requirements? I'm concerned that there is not a municipal state exemption that is going to negatively impact us.
Sorry, I had my phone on mute. I have not heard of any conversations regarding that. That's something that, I'd probably have to talk to the chairpersons of transportation in both the House and the Senate, but I have not heard of any conversations to that end, nor have I seen any pieces of legislation about that. But good question, and it's something we'll certainly keep our eyes and ears out for.
Okay. Any comments about the new lobbyist registration legislation that extends it to local authorities?
We have received some comments regarding that. Mostly questions. There were beforehand some counties that were they'd either already had their own individual countywide lobbyist registration systems or in the process of adopting ordinances to create their own lobby-wide registration systems. To my knowledge, most of those that haven't already done so have kind of stalled to wait to see how this new system operates. And I'm only aware, I believe Cook County decided to end their program and just utilize the states. Several counties I've talked to said, they've never had anyone lobby that they're aware of, county board members. So mostly questions at this stage. Haven't really had much feedback, regarding concerns, but always open to hear some. Obviously this is something new. I did have a conversation with the folks at the Secretary of State's office who oversee the lobbyist registration system, and they're very interested for feedback and open to feedback. They want to make sure it works. But so far, what I mentioned earlier is kind of the only feedback that at least I've received.
And it looks like, Mike, you might be on mute. So.
Indeed, thank you. On behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, big thank you to Kelly and Taylor today for their interesting, enlightening, and comprehensive presentations. As I mentioned earlier, if you registered for today's webinar, you'll receive the presentation materials and a link to the recording in a follow-up email. I also want to invite you to visit our website, go.illinois.edu/LGE, to register for future webinars. For example, in 2 weeks, on Thursday, February 10th, you can join us for a program on the Illinois EPA's financial assistance programs for water quality and watershed protection. And you can also use the same online resource to find recordings for a host of prior presentations on a wide variety of topics. So finally, we'd like to thank all of you for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Taylor, listen, I apologize. I think at some point there when I addressed you, I might have addressed you as Tyler rather than Taylor.